I want to speak about divine teachers today, and actually, I said to Becky yesterday, it's really a lousy title for what I want to say, but because I want to speak about community. And years ago, I read this story about a town in Pennsylvania that was settled in large part by people from a town in Italy. And at some point, there was it's a small town, and there was one doctor. And one day he was thinking to himself, it's really strange, but this is a true story, by the way, but I don't have almost anybody dying of heart disease. It just seemed really strange to him that in a town that size and with the age distribution of people, nobody was dying of heart disease. So he started a project, and he pulled files, and he realized not only were people not dying of heart disease, there was almost no suicide, there was almost no alcoholism, there was almost no drug issues, there was almost no crime, and almost nobody got peptic ulcers. And he couldn't figure out what it was, because their eating habits weren't very good. They ate tons of fat stuff and butter and cheese and pasta, and they drank a lot of wine, and a lot of them smoked. So they actually called in people from a university to do a study. And they, from a medical viewpoint, they couldn't figure out what was going on. And then they as they were doing the work in the town, they looked, and they noticed that any time you walked around the town, there were people hanging out, and there were people talking and laughing with one another. And as they looked more deeply, they realized in a lot of the homes in the town, there were 3 generations of people living in the same house. And they said, these people, they've created a place that's miraculous. And the conclusion that these medical teams came to was that the reason these people lived as long as they did and had the good medical conditions they did were because they treated each other with love and respect, and that they had created for themselves a magical community by how they treated one another. So the philosopher Martin Buber, when people would ask him, where is God? His response would be, God is found in relationships. God is found in between people. And so he was saying in a different way that God is love. And when we reach out to other people and we share ourselves, when we touch another person's life, we're allowing God to live through us. It's been said that we're God's hands and feet on this plane. We get the opportunity to make God real to one another. And Joan Borisenko wrote, who's a writer and actually a medical person too. She wrote, a mystic sees beyond the illusion of separateness into the intricate web of life in which all things are expressions of a single soul, and so a single whole rather. So she's saying that we're all one in God. We're all bound together, bonded through love, and the more that we give away, the more we get back. Joel Goldsmith, who's another mystical writer in New Thought, said it's impossible to love God and to not love your fellow man. Becky and I were walking in Cocoa Beach this week, and we saw a sign that Becky took a picture of, and she put it on Facebook, and Ed's got it up there. It's like a tattoo. I'm going to read it for you. It's like a tattoo parlor and piercing place, and they've got this big sign, and it says, all are welcome, all religions, all races and ethnicities, all gender identities, all sexual orientations, no attitudes. And we looked and we stopped him and he said, I gotta take a picture of that. You know, Ernest Holmes wrote, in the long run, everyone who loves is loved. All who give joy receive it back. And so Becky and I have gotten into reading a psychologist from Italy named Piero Ferrucci. He really writes some great spiritual stuff. He writes on kindness and he writes on other things. And in one of his books, he says there's lots of unresolved resentment on earth. And he said, suppose, he said, imagine you woke up one day and everything was forgiven that needed to be forgiven. He said, imagine if population X forgave population Y for the slaughter of their people that happened years and years ago. And he said, what if ethnic group Z forgave ethnic group Y for what happened in the past, because it oppressed them and it violated its women and it didn't treat its men well and it violated its kids and it plundered its possessions. And he said, what if nations A and B acknowledge each other's right to exist? And what if every individual forgiven every other individual? He said, what then? And he said, what it would be, he said, we could all breathe a sigh of relief. And he said, the atmosphere in the whole earth would be happier and it would be lighter. And he said, not only that, we'd all be free to live in the present and not look back and live with past recriminations. You know, it's through the connection of one another that we learn about our world, and our interactions with one another help us get to our full connection. So one of our ministers, Religious Heights ministers, is named Dennis Merritt Jones, and I know Petal has seen him speak, and Beck and I got to know him really well. And so one of his books, in fact, we're doing his book in the book group. He talked about a woman that went to his church one week. He had a church in California before he moved to Florida. And he said she had tears in her eyes. And she said to him, I had no idea that a church could be this warm, this joyous, and this much fun. She said, I feel so spiritually fed, and it's my first Sunday here. And he said back to her, he said, you know, maybe it's because you feel the presence of God making itself known to you. Maybe what you feel is God's unconditional love coming through the people in the center. And he said in spiritual community, that's what we feel. And it brought back to Becky and I were talking about this, it brought back to me a story of somebody, and I think I've told it here before, so I won't do it in a whole bunch of detail, but Becky and I, when I actually think it was before I was a minister, this couple was coming to our church. We were both practitioners in Seal Beach, California, and we got to know them really well because I flirted with the woman one day, and I asked her if it was okay, and then she got cancer, and she was dying, and we would go to their house and pray with her, and one night after we got done praying, her husband asked us to sit in the living room, and he said, you know, we've gotten really close, and there's something about me that you don't know that I want to share with you. He said, I am a heterosexual cross-dresser. He said, I'm not gay, but I like to dress up as a woman. And we had this long conversation about it, and eventually his wife died. And I didn't see him in church as much. So I asked him, this is the reason that I'm telling you the story. I asked him one Sunday, his name was Jim, and I asked him, what's going on? Why aren't you here as much as before? And I don't remember when he dressed as a woman, what the name that he used was, well, we're gonna say it's Alice, just. And he said, let me tell you why. He said, when I come here to this church, I feel a lot of love and caring from people when I come as Jim. There's another religious science church town over. I can go there as Jim and feel really loved. And the next week, I could go there as Alice and feel just as loved. That doesn't happen here. And I always felt, wouldn't that be the ideal way to be in spiritual community, that no matter who he came as, he was still who he was. And he can feel that love. So Dennis Merritt Jones has an exercise in one of his books. So if you're comfortable, we're not going to do anything out loud to one. Just close your eyes and go with me and imagine what he's asking us to imagine. So he's saying, imagine that you're wealthy in every way. You've got a gorgeous, huge house. You got a couple of really beautiful luxury cars. You've got a beautiful and fit body. You're a great athlete. And to boot, you're a genius. You have, in short, everything. And you're a wonderful human being. And he said, doesn't that seem perfect? Isn't that the perfect life? And then he says, imagine with all of that, that you're the only living person on the planet. Changes it up, doesn't it? You can come back now, but it changes it when all of a sudden you realize you're here all alone. And he says, you know, it's relationships make our life worth living. Being alone, could you imagine what that would be like? How lonely it would be, how boring it would be. Every relationship that we have is an opportunity to do God's work, to become a vessel through which love flows through freely and easily. And I read this week about a woman named Patricia Sun, who's a writer and a healer. And at a workshop, one of her workshops, somebody said to her, how do you do the healing? How do you heal? And her response back was, I don't really know. I just feel their pain and I love them. I just feel their pain and I love them. And it really struck me because a few weeks ago, I called a really good friend of Becky and mine that we hadn't talked in a long time, and I didn't get her. I left a voicemail, and she never called me back. And I was thinking about her. I said, gee, I gotta call her again. And before I could call her, I got a text from her the other night, and she said, sorry I haven't called you back. I am so stressed and so unhappy. Who knew life could be this challenging? Too much to talk about right now. I'll call you when I can. And we talked about it, and part of our response back was, we love you. We're here for you. You call when you're ready, and we'll be here. You're in our prayers. And it's kind of like, it reminded me, I think, of what Patricia's son was saying. You know, what else could we do but sit there and feel our friend's pain and just love her and let her know that she's not alone that she's loved, and that she's cared for. So I want to tell you about an experiment that Alan Cohen wrote about, and that I actually tried, and I'll tell you how it worked out. So he writes in one of his books, when he was a young guy in his 30s, he was living in a house with a group of other guys, and I guess they all had long hair, and they had beards. I know they had beards because he said that. And they had an elderly woman as their neighbor who could not stand them. She did everything she could to make their life miserable, and she even started a petition to force them to move out. It didn't work, and so she put a fence up around between their property. And then Alan Cohen goes to a lecture, and the person doing the lecture said, I want to do an exercise with you. I want everybody, and I'm not asking you to do this, I want everybody to close your eyes, and I want you to bring to your imagination a person that you're having a conflict with. Close your eyes, bring that person into your mind. And he said, and now I want you to imagine that you're walking towards this person and you're holding their hand and you embrace them and you whisper in their ear, I love you. And Alan Cohen wrote, it was really hard for him just to even picture this woman and to do this in his mind, to hold her hand and to whisper and embrace her, I love you. And then the person leading the lecture said, if you do this practice for 5 minutes a day for 3 weeks, one of two things will happen. Either your relationship will be healed or the person will leave your life. Alan Cohen wrote, to tell you the truth, reader, I didn't do it. However, the next week, this woman stopped, he only did it once. This woman stopped one of the other guys who lived with him and said, you know, I have really been a terrible neighbor. I'm so sorry. I want to be friends with you boys. She called them boys, but I want to be friends with you. Is there anything we could do to make up? And she took some tomatoes she had been raising and gave them to the guy. So I thought if that could work for Alan Cohen one time, I had 3 people in our center that were driving me absolutely batty. So I did it. I started to do it, and every day I imagined the 3 of them coming and me whispering as hard as it was in their ear how much I loved them. And before 3 weeks was up, 2 of them came to me and apologized and healed, and the 3rd one left the church. So it's really a powerful, at least it was for Alan and me, a powerful exercise. So maybe perhaps you want to try it sometime. So, you know, Rumi, one of my favorite Rumi quotes is, out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I will meet you there. So I read this week that Robert Taylor is a minister and somebody who was raised in South Africa. And he writes about an African concept called Ubuntu, U-B-U-N-T-U. And he said it means I am only a person in the context of other people. I am only human because you are human, and your humanity affirms mine. Without that, there is no wholeness. And he tells a story about a fellow named Carl that he knew, and Carl volunteered once a week in a home for immigrants. And he did it for years, and then started to think, what am I doing here? Am I doing any good? Really can't measure it. I don't know if I'm going to keep doing it. And then one Friday, he went in on Fridays, one of the men came to him in broken English and said to him, thank you for coming here on Fridays. It means so much to all of us. We talk about how much good you do for us. And he told Robert, he said, that was for me, it was a gift. He said, I realized that my compassionate presence was just as important as my goal-driven business career. So I want to tell you a story. I think I might have done this a long time ago, but when Becky and I were in Arizona, we had a woman named Danielle who was coming to our center. And we really got to like Danielle. She was kind of a character, and she was a former school teacher, retired, really smart, and she was pretty much alone. She had 2 children, a son that they had a broken relationship, so she had no contact with him, and she had a daughter who was a long-haul truck driver that she didn't see, who lived in the same town, but she didn't see her anymore. And in fact, Danielle took a class from Becky and I, and she almost took the class over. She was so smart, and I used to have to whisper to Becky, tell her to keep quiet, tell her to keep quiet. So, because I knew if I did it would hurt her feelings. And then Danielle got Alzheimer's, and she went downhill really fast. And she lived in between where we lived and the church. So I would go visit her every single day. And one day when I went to visit her, when I parked my car, I didn't go in, and I just thought to myself, why are you doing this? You know, is this proving to you what a great minister you are? I mean, you walk in there, she has no idea who you are. And sometimes it was really difficult. She could be really difficult. And I thought, why are you doing this? You're gonna keep doing it? And I got out of the car and I walked in, and I walked into her room, and she was asleep. And I remember thinking, thank God, I don't have to stay a long time. And I walked over to the bed, and I stood by the bed, and I just looked at her for a little bit, and then I closed my eyes and I did a prayer, and I turned to go. And as I turned to go, her hand flew out and grabbed my wrist. And I remember thinking, wow, she's really strong for somebody so feeble. And she opened her eyes, and she looked at me, and she said, please don't go. She said, I don't know who you are, but it really feels good when you're here. So please don't go. So I stayed, and when I got back in the car, I thought, got my answer today, didn't I? You know, she had no idea who I was, but there was something that my being there made her feel good, made her feel that somebody cared. So I want to close. I told my wife I was going to put her on the spot today, and she said, please don't, but I'm going to. So Becky taught a class. It was 12 weeks long, and on arts and healing a few years ago. I've talked about it before. And I was like so blown, I mean, we've been married for a long time, and I was so blown away at the command that she had in this class and what she did. And I keep telling her, do it again, and she keeps resisting. So I think it would be a good idea if some of you bugged Becky to, even if it wasn't for 12 weeks, you know, we talked about those of you that took the foundation class, we could do that class, even if she did it for 8 weeks rather than 12, because she thought it was too long. And it was a fabulous class, which I didn't think it would be, because I'm not an artist. But
you don't have to be an artist.
see, you don't have to be.
She wants to do it, or she would have kept her mouth shut.
So that would, I'm serious, it would really be a good class to so I'll just tell, I wasn't gonna do this, but as long as she interrupted me. The day of the class, because I told her I would take it, when she started to take out all the pens and pencils and stuff, I got really nervous, because I'm not an artist. So I told her, I said, you know, I don't think I'm gonna take the class. And she said to me again, you don't have to be an artist. And I said, well, I'm not gonna do it. And then she came to me later and she said, you know what, I don't want you to do the class, because I'll be too nervous that you're judging it, which of course made me feel that big. So I went to her and I said, I'll tell you what, I'll take the first class, and if I like it, I'll come back. I absolutely loved it. It was like fabulous. So one of the things we did, Becky did an exercise, an end-of-life exercise. And it came to me this week when I was preparing this message that what I wrote on that end-of-life class was more than about the end of life, but it was really about relationships. So I want to read it, what I wrote. This is what I wrote in that class. And I'll just say, leading into what I wrote, Becky did a meditation on the end of life, and then I wrote. And so this is what I wrote. As the meditation began, I felt myself going very deep. I experienced a feeling of complete peace. My guide and I floated along in silence. I was awed by the beauty of what I was seeing, colors that were more vibrant than anything I had ever seen, and the sounds were beyond any melodies that had ever been written. While I had left my body behind, somehow I retained the ability to see and communicate through what I guess we would call mental telepathy. Soon we came to a curtain. I simply slipped through while my guide veered off and let me know he would wait for me. I wasn't prepared for what came next. There were hundreds of people from my life, all waiting for me. Old friends I hadn't seen from kindergarten, high school friends, college buddies, neighbors, teachers, girls I dated, work friends, former bosses and subordinates, people who had hurt me and people I had hurt. They were there. There they were. The love and kindness they exuded were almost palpable. I went and floated before each one. I have never felt so embraced by love. To some I said only hello, others I said more to, and still others I asked questions. No one responded. They just looked at me with love. I slowly came to realize that in this realm, words were hardly necessary because love spoke louder than anything I could say. After what seemed like an instant, I sensed I was ready to depart and that my guide was waiting. As I slipped back through the curtain, I was surprised to see a different guide waiting for me. I looked at him and I said, I know you. You're the little Chinese man. You're Becky's guide. Why are you here? He just smiled and beckoned me to sit down on a bench that was nearby. Today's lesson was to teach you to relax and stop worrying so much, he said. All of the people that were here today were part of your life. Some of them had big roles, some not so big, but they all touched you in some way and you touched them. It didn't matter if you hurt them or they hurt you, or you liked one another or despised one another. In the end, all of that disappeared and all that was left was love. I'm sure you could see that by the way everyone was so glad to see you and embrace you. When you go back, lighten up. Try and remember that everything you experience is a piece of a greater puzzle. Some you'll understand, some you won't. But in the end, it's all good. As if he could sense what I was thinking, he said, you'll notice none of your family was here today. You know they all love you. Today was about showing you we're all family, and it's not our parentage that decides, but our humanity and our connection to one source. As I was about to head back to my body, my new guide said, stop. Don't you want to know why I'm here? I'm part of the lesson. You see, if we're all one in the eyes of God, then I'm not only Becky's guide, I'm yours too. In the oneness of the universe, there's no mine and yours. There's only ours. With that, I returned to my body and awoke feeling refreshed and renewed.
Very good.
Thank you for being here today. God bless you.